All right, friends. Welcome to Naturally Speaking. Just a couple of housekeeping items here before we get started with tonight's talk. This is a webinar format on Zoom, which means you will not be able to see fellow participants, only the hosts and the panelists. So don't panic, there's nothing wrong with your computer. And to ask questions, and I hope you ask lots of them, you're going to use the Q&A function. And the Q&A function will appear either at the top of your menu bar or at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can ask those questions at any time. They actually queue up. And what we'll do is at the end of Cyrus's talk, he will answer all of your questions, and I'll go ahead and read them aloud to him. Okay. Please keep your mic muted unless, of course, you need to use your mic to ask a question. That's perfectly okay. You can raise your hand in that case with the raise hand function. And captions should be available right now on your screen. If they aren't, there should be a little CC for closed captions on your screen that you can go ahead and click, and that will give you some captions here today. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to stop my share here. To introduce tonight's speaker, I had the pleasure to meet Cyrus just a few months ago when he stepped into the role of my supervisor, the interim role here. And among many things that I've learned from this learned gentleman is his field of study. Maybe you are like me and you didn't realize that there is such a thing called an environmental historian. And it is a fascinating field of study and something that I think is very relevant to this age of the Anthropocene, where human impact, human history, and human future is really determining what's going to be happening on planet Earth, basically with our local ecosystems, etc. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Cyrus. Go ahead, Cyrus.
Hi, everyone. I can tell from the attendees listed that I know some of you. I may not know all of you, however. Regardless, I am happy that you've come out tonight because, like Sam, before I became a graduate student of American history, I did not know that environmental history was a field of study. It was something that I had been working in public history for about 8 years before I enrolled at the University of Washington's doctoral history program. I had already even gotten a master's degree in history, but I attended a school in New York City where seeing oneself as apart from nature was a part of how New Yorkers saw the world. So during my master's program, I really wasn't exposed to this discipline either. But as I began to study history as an academic, I really came to the realization that every single story in history has an environmental story as well. And that if you omit or you don't treat the environment as an actor, as a force that creates history, and you don't realize that environmental forces are often one of the primary things that shape the way humans behave and the way humans interact, then you're going to be missing a lot of what's going on. And so as I began my studies, I really found myself gravitating to the group of people who spend most of their time or who try with their work to put the environment in the center of their studies. So a rough definition of the field of study is really that it is a way of studying history that recognizes that nature has agency. That is kind of the mantra of environmental historians. And what we mean by that really is that the actions of nature are independent of humans, while they can be influenced by humans, and they have a way of causing outcomes that show that natural preferences will be reasserted, right? So nature is a force equal, if not stronger than humans when we understand the way humans have behaved. And environmental history can be applied to almost any different type of study, like any period. It can be incorporated into economic histories. It can be incorporated into political history, right? For instance, you can't understand the New Deal period without studying the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl is really a history of how humans misrelated to the land and began to really believe in the idea that rain follows the plow, that if you till a dry land, rain will come to it. And that actually worked for quite a while until humans began to overuse that land and to work it to the point where it was unhealthy. You could equally do a New Deal history that examines how our landscape has been changed by the creation of farm subsidies, right? It's a human action that then has many different ways of reshaping nature, and then that is reshaped by nature. So with environmental history, you really get a way of understanding all sorts of things that we could just not understand before, or that we had an imperfect understanding of. And, for me, this is why this is an especially more relevant field, but it's also, for me, kind of unfortunate that it is a field that is often missed, because so much of the works are really written for academic audiences who are going to be capable of analyzing the actual science scholarship and historical scholarship alongside each other. And obviously, if you can have someone, if you're writing the sort of environmental history that uses cutting edge science, that uses papers produced by people in the field, and who is able to do primary source work, the chances is that you're going to be writing for a very, very, very select audience. And so one of the really important things that the field has increasingly done has been to try and make sure that people are writing for popular audiences as well as for scholarly audiences, because this is a field that has direct lessons that are applicable to our present day world. So I wanted to give you one of the things that makes, I feel like, environmental history such a special field is just the diversity of studies that can be improved, or that can gain new insights by putting the environment in the center. So I wanted to give here a few examples of sort of typologies of environmental histories, right? Or certain recurring fields of study. And for those of us who work in the National Park Service, one of the most important fields that environmental history examines is public lands management. And when I quit the Park Service to go to graduate school, it was unexpected to me as I began to do my coursework that increasingly I would take entire classes where much of what I read was about public land management, and especially the philosophies that led to public land management. And then sometimes, by actually examining the individuals involved, you could see how personal circumstances or individual biases or obsessions seeped into the way we manage our land, right? Like a classic example is Gifford Pinchot, the father of the U.S. Forest Service, how much the fact that his education took place in Germany under a group of people who created the idea of the forest as a managed system to be managed only for maximal yields for resources, led him to ignore a lot of the factors that actually yield healthy forests, right? And so you can trace the evolution of forest management from one man going to a German college, the only one that or the best one for forestry at the time, studying the methods that were being used in Germany, and then applying models that worked for European forests, but didn't work for American forests. And then by not knowing the importance of biodiversity, planting even aged forests of exactly the same species of trees, leading to forests that lacked the diversity necessary for a healthy forest, and leading to untold tragedies later on. And, you know, that's one thing I learned, or one thing that you continue to learn. But what you see in there is actually the one narrative that underlies every single environmental history study, and the one factor that makes it, that unifies the field, which is that basically you have three things happen. You have man believes they understand an aspect of nature so well that they can control and improve upon it, and can make sure that they and can alter nature in a way that can reshape it. And then what mankind finds in the process is that nature doesn't behave the way that humans expected it to, and that then the unfolding uncertainties cause a series of reactions back and forth between human beings trying to manage nature and a natural force, imperfectly understood natural forces, reasserting their importance. And you know, for me, that really does decenter the way history has been done before, right? Before you gave nature this role as an equal, if not superior actor to mankind, you ended up with a situation where we kept missing parts of the story and kept ignoring aspects that are really key to understanding the past. So I wanted to, you know, give an example, right? If you were an environmental historian working with our local histories, or in our local community, what sort of stories you can tell, right? And these are sort of, what I'm giving you here are sort of typologies of environmental history, right? This story of cattle in the landscape here, right? What we did both in the creation and transformation of indigenously managed landscapes into industrial agriculture. You could look at that and you could say, well, what changed in the plant communities of San Diego from having cattle grazing it instead of having it managed as it was managed prior to colonization? And then you could trace that and see, and then you could also ask about the cattle themselves. What happened to them, right, after they were raised here? And they would be turned into hides. And so you could then trace the chemical processing that occurred to make the hides. You could look at that site and see how it changed. And you could look at the people performing the work, right? We know that hide tanning is a dangerous occupation, and it's one that leaves a lot of industrial disease. So you could conduct sort of a public health study of what it was like working in that industry alongside a history that traces the flow of those commodities. And that works equally for fishing, right? We were once a major fishing community, and fishing is one of the most commonly studied aspects of environmental history, or subject for environmental histories, because fish know no borders, right? Fish cross international boundaries, and fish don't always behave as expected. And yet human laws and regulations that no nation states govern the way the fishing industry behaves. And so you're trying to map what regulating fishing does, is that it maps human laws and expects animals to obey the laws of the nation. And this can make it a really interesting field for study that can reveal a lot about how communities are shaped, because it's sort of this intersection of law, labor, and natural forces. You know, the other one here that I want to sort of flag here amongst my examples is then reconstructing the past landscape, right? When I asked the question, what did Cabrillo see when he came to San Diego. What I'm really asking is, how have we changed our landscape since then? And what would it look like to use historical records and environmental studies to try and recreate the plant landscapes of the past, to recreate the animal landscapes of the past, and to recreate the physical landscape of the past? What was the water level? What was, how were mountains in this area different? What did the coastline look when hundreds of years of erosion had not taken place? Would it even be recognizable to us? These are the sort of questions that can be asked and answered by scholarship that foregrounds the environment. So I guess, the environmental history that I know the best is the work that I've dealt with myself and that my own studies have been about. And my work was kind of I did not complete my dissertation, I must add. I don't want to give you the false impression that I earned the right to letters after my name. I have not yet. I completed all of my coursework. I passed exams with honors. I wrote drafted 4 or 5 chapters, 4 chapters, maybe 5. It was a while ago, but I found myself missing what I'm doing right now, which is talking with the public and shaping the public. As I said earlier, it can be the case that when you work with highly specialized topics, you only talk to highly specialized audiences. So my work started very personally. I grew up in Kanawha County, West Virginia. Kanawha County, West Virginia is the birthplace of Union Carbide. It is one of the largest chemical producing regions in the United States. And it's a place that often produces chemicals that are rather caustic and that have quite a lot of danger if human beings are exposed to them in any significant dose. I grew up in a place where it was normalized for your teachers to have plastic tarps under their desk, and for when certain alarms sounded, for the teachers to tarp up the windows and wait for the all clear signal, because we understood that we had to take certain precautions when there were chemical leaks, and those were chemical leaks. It was just a normal fact of life to know that there was this sort of toxic industry that you were living amongst. And as I grew up and went to college, I discovered that apparently that's not how most of the United States lives, that is not a normal sort of thing. And as I grew older and studied more and just thought more, I wanted to know why it was that my hometown had this sort of chemical complex that didn't come from nowhere. There had to be a reason this work was being done in my hometown. And what I sort of also came across during my master's in history at the City College of New York, before I enrolled in the doctoral program, I was taking classes in American slavery. That's a history that I've specialized a lot in. And I decided I wanted to see how slavery operated in my home community, because I knew that we had slavery in West Virginia. Just because we declared our independence from Virginia does not mean that we were not a slave state like Virginia for a huge portion of our history. And I started reading a book about slavery in Appalachia, and I found that nearly about 170 years before I was born, there was also a chemical industry in the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia. But the difference was that it was a slave-operated chemical industry. It produced salt, which is a form of labor that is no different really than our current chemical industry. It's just that it's not a highly specialized chemical. And so, I'm sorry, I went ahead a little bit. And so I sort of began to ponder, like, and be troubled by the fact that my home community, the place that I lived in, 18 years of my life, grew up in, didn't know that it was the largest site of enslaved industrial labor, and didn't realize that not only did we not, most people have no idea that slavery took place, but they didn't realize that it was a different form of slavery than the slavery that you normally encounter, right? When you picture an enslaved person, you picture an agricultural setting, maybe, plantations, or, as historians are increasingly calling them, slave labor camps, because that's what they are. Plantation is a word that allows us to escape the fact that it was a slave labor camp, and it romanticizes that reality. Yet the plantation is the site you most associate with slavery, but enslaved people were everywhere in early America, right? In New York City, 1 out of 3 people at the peak of slavery was in New York was enslaved. And when you're talking about 1/3 of the population in a condition of bondage, that means enslaved people are doing every type of work. There will be agricultural work, but there will be industrial work. And I didn't think, as I thought about it, I realized, like, industrial slavery is just something that the American people don't know much about because of this misconception. They might know that there was urban slavery, where enslaved people did work on docks or on boats, but still that escapes people's attention. But industrial slavery is an interesting thing in that it challenges the entire narrative of industrialization in the United States, right? We have a narrative of industrialization that says that industry and factories came out of mills in New England, where women were performing free labor. But if you realize that there were thousands of people working in toxic industries in the American South, and that was equally a birthplace of industry, that experience colors the way industry develops. And that sort of slavery is such an all-encompassing institution that I began to realize that slavery didn't just impact the labor and didn't just impact the social relations, but slavery impacted the environment, right? The use of slave laborers and the presence of enslaved people occupying space led slavery to be encoded in the land and in the practices. Now, unfortunately, as I began to realize this was a subject I needed to study more of, and became so interested in what happened in my hometown in the early from 1800, let's say from the 1790s until the 1860s and beyond into the 1880s, I faced one big problem that all historians face of the 19th century, was that my sources looked like this. Okay, people may glamorize the work of a historian. Maybe I did before I went to graduate school for American history. But if you are doing 19th century history, when you are looking in the archives, what you are doing is going and trying to decipher handwritten documents written in haste, oftentimes by people who may only be semi-literate compared to today's time, so their spellings will be inexact at a time when spellings were not fully standardized. And so, I want to understand that this is one of the things that I think actually makes environmental history an important discipline and separates it from environmental science that looks at the past, which is that us historians actually do find this exciting. I hate to say this, but for me, this handwritten document and reading thousands of handwritten documents, tens of thousands of pages of handwritten documents from the 19th century was actually very exciting for me. I found out things that I never could have found elsewhere. I found somebody, a direct ancestor of one of my best friends in the whole world, working to free over 20 people from slavery. And this is an ancestor who shares her name, who she never knew of, right? My friend is Catherine Moore. This person is Catherine, my friend's Catherine Venable Moore. This is Catherine Venable. This is a direct ancestor sharing the name, but who she never knew of. And in a community where as many as 3,000 people were enslaved on an annual basis, it was exciting to see that not only was there definite opposition or changes of heart about the institution of slavery by rich slave owners, but someone who literally was an ancestor of a friend was the best person in this entire community. I discovered other exciting things, right? I got to pose questions about the past, right? So as I said, I had to ask, how did the use of enslaved labor impact the environment long-term and influence labor history? And what I found really was that you can see how economic patterns play out on the environment, right? And then how the environment responds. So, right, our salt industry that I studied, one of the things that made it interesting and that the environment shaped was that they did not use, for the most part, slaves that were owned by the salt companies. That is because salt is a commodity industry. The economics of commodity industries are such that you have boom-bust cycles. Enslaved people will be the largest capital expense that you have. And if you own too many people and you've invested all of your capital in human beings and the market falls apart for salt, and you need to reduce your production, then you're going to need to reduce your labor force. And so leasing individuals became a solution for that. But what you saw was production ramping up, getting as dangerous and as fast as possible, and the environment being transformed at a pell-mell pace, such that people were incorporating cheaper technologies. Natural gas, for instance, was first harnessed in the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia as a power source, and they didn't understand them fully, so they were blowing up entire areas. You would have a natural gas leak, you'd have a fire, you would have a major problem. I found things that reminded me even more of the town I grew up than I expected. I found that apparently, and I don't think this has ever been covered by anyone before, but I found that oil was something that stood in the way of salt production. And so in the early 19th century, oil was worthless. Oil was worse than worthless because it clogged everything up and it stuck to things. And so it turns out that the community where I grew up in, no one discussed this growing up. I didn't know this until I just did my studies. There was a lot of oil there. We could have been very wealthy and a major oil producing center in the United States, except that at that point in time, oil was valueless and worse than valueless. So all of the oil that lay beneath our land was poured into the river in the dead of night, because if people found out that your salt well had oil in it, they said, well, that'll get gunked up. And so no one would invest in the building of a salt well. And so we ended up with so much oil thrown into the river that on at least one occasion, a 12-mile stretch of river burnt when a match was thrown in. And that the riverboat captains of the time would refer to the Kanawha River as Old Greasy, because there was just oil slicks up and down the river. And, I also discovered things like unexpected levels of technological innovation in the Kanawha Valley. The first salt well was a unique innovation in drilling, and eventually drilling technology developed so highly in the Kanawha Valley that drillers began being sought out from our area. And so the first oil wells in Pennsylvania were drilled by Kanawha Valley drillers. I found that, in fact, the first real industrial application of a coal boiler was in the Kanawha Valley because, and this is an environmental story, when the first salt wells were being built, first salt furnaces were being built, they used old growth trees, as many as they could, to boil salt, right? A salt boiler requires a lot of fuel. And then it just so happened that once all of the trees were gone, they found that there were coal deposits nearby, and they redesigned the boilers to incorporate coal. And so by 1819, the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia had coal boilers boiling salt. And this was at a time where coal was not being used, right? That if you trace, right, the industrialization of the United States, and you say industrial history starts with those mills in Massachusetts, well, at that point in time, those mills were water powered, right? That was their force. But in the Kanawha Valley, we were burning coal. You know, and as I continued to do research, I sort of came to a deeper sort of understanding as I posed these questions, and as I asked, like, what is the impact of this one industry on my valley on my hometown long term, and how can it be traced? I began to see something else, which was that the salt industry, it choked out any other possible course of development. That once you commit to industrial extraction, you have toxic byproducts that change the community, right? So I read newspaper articles about how farmers in the nearby areas, beside a salt furnace, their cows would end up losing their hooves. They would dissolve eventually from all of the runoff that was put off by these salt furnaces. I read accounts of German vintners who moved to the Kanawha Valley because the land was cheap, and they tried to start wineries. And they said the soot from having 60 massive furnaces bellowing day and night meant that my grape harvest was poor, and there was no way that I could have a winery there. And so what I realized eventually as I went on was that, well, coal and natural gas and chemicals are what we have in the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia. And it's still, it started in the 19th century, and it's still what we have, right? The modern chemical industry is just a new manifestation of the practices of the salt industry. The coal industry has changed technologically, and the gas industry has changed technologically, but they're still doing the same thing. It's an extractive industry. And what I realized was that once we began to change our environment so drastically, and we began to foreclose other opportunities for development in our economy that nature could have handed to us if it would have taken alternate paths. And in that sense, maybe my analysis is deterministic, right? I say, well, this one path means unalterably that we're going to reach this end. Maybe that's a little simplistic, historically speaking, but it's hard to not say and not see when you look at the environmental legacy of extractive industry, and you look at how human health is also a part of environmental history, right? And you ask, what happens to our human beings in this area from being exposed to toxic chemicals on a regular basis? What happens to human beings from being exposed to toxic workplaces on a regular basis? What happens to animals in our area? What happens to the fertility of the land in the area? At what point do we reach such a density and such an overwhelming capture by extractive industry that we don't have any more choices left, and that our land cannot be used in any other way, or it's very difficult to use our land in any other way? And what I really saw was that these environmental choices that we took early on were influenced by the use of slave labor, that the philosophy of slavery, that the ideology of mastery did not just include human beings, but involved nature, right? And that the human beings who were used to owning other people were used to owning natural forces in a way that maybe in other communities, right, at that mill in New England, people do understand the river is a natural force, right? And they understand that the river has agency in ways that they don't understand that coal does, or that enslaved people do, because the river varies, but they can continue to exert their mastery over and over again against these human beings and against an extractive industry where you have inputs that are rationalized. And so though I never completed my dissertation, I do have 220 pages that someday I will turn into articles for public consumption because there are tremendous hidden stories in there. Some of them not environmental, some of them just very interesting legal histories. I have a story of a man. I'm the only historian to have discovered this. A man who was illegally enslaved, broke his chains in the middle of the Ohio River, killed his enslavers, was recaptured, and then broke out of jail twice right before his execution in order to delay it until he was able to get powerful friends to free him. And he was supposed to be the first man executed in my home county. And, I have stories of people like Catherine Venable, who was born into a wealthy salt merchant family and instead chose to make her life about being a gateway to freedom for other people. Someone who must have been truly been at odds with her entire community. And, I have stories, horrific stories. In the last chapter that I wrote, or that I was going to write, I have the story of one of the first major coal mine operations in the 1870s, where interracial workers in coal mines strike successfully against a coal boss and gain better provisions. And so the coal boss decides he has to break up the racial unity amongst his workforce. And so he uses company resources to orchestrate a mass lynching, or not a mass lynching, but to orchestrate a lynching using his white workers as the lynchers and leading this lynch mob, so that these two communities that had come together and seen each other together were not able to unite as workers, but were separated by race. And, for me, I feel there's real value, though, that as I look at these stories, I never forget that nature is an actor, right? That everything that happens that these people are doing, if you don't take nature into account, you are telling an incomplete story. And there I come to the end of my prepared talk. And so I am here to invite questions.
Wonderful, Cyrus. Before we get to these questions, I want to comment on how I think this field of study is really interesting, because to me personally, because I often marvel at how we treat this planet, sometimes with respect, oftentimes not with respect and kindness and thoughtfulness and mindfulness. And I think a lot of that is because we feel like we are outside of nature, right? We are above it, we're better than it, or we're just not a part of it. And that is simply not the case. Right? We are a part of this natural world just as much as the, plants in your backyard and the birds singing in the tree. And so I think maybe a lot of, I feel like there's a correlation there between that and the field of study for environmental history. Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, that makes a lot of sense, right? If you recognize that human beings are existing in natural systems, right? And that every moment, as much as we try to artificially create environments for ourselves that are climate controlled, right? That are furnished in ways that allow us to forget that every single thing around us is derived from nature, right? There's, no matter how artificial or chemical it is, there were still natural components and scientific forces were involved in its creation.
Right.
You can treat humanity with you can treat the world around you with a sense of dominion that will work for a while, perhaps, but that will ultimately fail because you haven't given nature its due.
Yeah, very good. I like that perspective. Obviously, I'm a little biased as a conservation biologist. I like that perspective, but it's why I became a conservation biologist, really. We've got a question here from Lauren, and she asks, how can we incorporate environmental history into programs at the park?
Ooh, that is a good question. I would say that one way we could really do that is by showing people the way natural forces shaped human actions in the park, right? I could see, for instance, with our military history, we could focus on the labor that led to the creation, the alterations of Point Loma that occurred to make it into a military space and into a successful military space. And we could try and show what it was like before the military began transforming it. We could show also the many ways in which the military actually worked with the nature to create some of their structures and some of their emplacements, and then how the military worked against nature, right? How erosion undermined the best laid plans of the military on Point Loma. And then you can sort of get a full spectrum of a military history that is told through the lens of transforming Point Loma into a fort and not into the natural space that it was before.
Mm. Yeah, I think we need to sit down maybe and start rethinking this and how to incorporate this. I really like that.
Well, I think the way we talk about the Cabrillo voyage does incorporate environmental history pretty well, in the sense we talk about the food, we talk about the animals, we recognize the non-human living factors that were involved in his voyage. But
Right.
everything could include the environment, right, Sam?
Yes, always. And I think, as we wait for more questions to come in, I had a question for you that kind of piggybacks on that a little bit is, I'm used to looking at the world through a scientific lens, right? And thinking about land management as science-informed decisions. But how can environmental history assist with better or more robust land management practices?
Well, I think the one thing that it allows that you can do is you can peer into the minds of people in the past who made land management choices, right? If there's a written record, you can literally see in the case of some people, if they leave enough records behind, you can know what was going on in their life when they made certain decisions. And then you can see how they perceived the changes they intentionally made and how they misperceived them. And it can give us a way to maybe break through our own lens. But it can also, you can literally do a study, right, of a single bill, right? Like, say, the Wilderness Act, right? You can say, well, this is what the Wilderness Act defines as wilderness. How did land managers then work to shape this legal definition of wilderness onto actual land? And what does it mean to have a legal definition, right, of this? And how did people actually react to the law and their desire to serve the law while shaping nature?
Right. Tristan has a question for you now.
Oh, okay.
Do you see any similarities with the use of enslaved labor and the impact on the environment, the current use of migrant labor, or the extraction of resources from other countries for use in the United States?
Kristen,
A hardball question.
did you read some of my dissertation? Because one of my main arguments, it's a good question, was that there was a spectrum of coercion that existed when I studied the Kanawha Valley, right? You had enslaved people, but you also had free Blacks who lived under a legal shadow. An interesting thing that existed in the state of Virginia was that after the year 1805, it was illegal to be free and Black in the state of Virginia. And what that meant is that if you were freed from slavery after 1805, or were a free person who moved to Virginia after 1805, you had 1 year to leave the state of Virginia, or you could be legally re-enslaved by the state of Virginia. Now, this was something that didn't actually happen, but what you could see, there were two different moments that I identified. I read about 80 years of court records for one county, and for my study, and what you could see were two different moments where there were what I termed free Black panics. And a free black panic was a moment when suddenly the grand jury decides that they're going to enforce the law, making it illegal to be free in the state of Virginia, and hauls in every single free black person and threatens them, and makes their lives tenuous, forces them to engage with the legal system, right? A legal system that they know, as they're living in freedom, that if they go near the courthouse, there's the chance that they're going to be re-enslaved because of the law making it illegal for them to be free and black in that state. And so what I would argue with the migrant worker analogy is what you see, right, is the fact that someone's legal status and legal disability can then be used to coerce them into a workplace that they would not otherwise willingly go into. And it's something, you know, that's inherent in slavery, but it's inherent also in the migrant worker situation, but it's applicable in so many other areas, right? There are so many ways in which people end up in circumstances where where they feel coerced, right? The example that I was going to get into were the original, at the end of my dissertation, were the original coal camps, right? Where regardless of your race, because the company store was the only store in town, and because the coal company owned your home, you paid you in scrip, a currency that you could only use. I don't know how many of you are familiar with scrip. It's not US currency. The coal company would pay you not in US currency, but in coal company dollars, which could only be spent at institutions owned by the coal company. You were stuck in an ecosystem in which your wealth was tied into your employer and your standard of living was tied into your employer. And so if you challenged your employer, they could evict you from your home. They could force you out of your community. They could leave you with worthless scrip that you could not spend. And, you know, that led to a level of coercion and a level of labor conditions that would otherwise be protested against. And so it's always worth considering whether how or whether labor coercion is a factor that contributes to working conditions that would otherwise be unacceptable, and to environmental conditions that would otherwise be unacceptable, because the worker has far less agency and power in those situations. And it would certainly be a way to explain, for instance, the reckless use of pesticides sometimes that has been documented in agricultural industries that disregards the cumulative impact of inhaling pesticides on the health of agricultural laborers, for instance. Something that was studied by my environmental history mentor, Linda Nash, in her book, Inescapable Ecologies.
Yeah, fascinating. I feel like your field of study takes such a deep look at these various different institutions and can draw these connections that might otherwise be missed. So we do have a couple more questions here for Cyrus. How can environmental history inform us on ways to break away from the inertia of historic/present land use, e.g. in Virginia and West Virginia, coal mining industries, or in California, ranchers, or in South Dakota, oil production? Want me to repeat it?
No, I'm just thinking it's tough, right? And that's what I was sort of saying about the sort of inevitability argument. I think, though, you can present examples of how different choices led to different outcomes in similar places. I'm thinking about a book that I read about the difference between Vermont and the area that became Shenandoah National Park, during the White Mountains versus Shenandoah during the New Deal era, and how these areas had extremely similar conditions, both in terms of economy, demographics, land use, everything, but that because of the local community lacked power within the state of Virginia to resist the National Park Service's desire to oust them from their homes to create a national park easily accessible to powerful people in Washington, D.C., where their human history would be erased, versus the people of Vermont, who had local power and a local government who were able to stop the Park Service when it tried to evict them from their homes to create a similar sort of park in the mountains of Vermont. You can see that, people, just a few different choices can make a difference, and that the cumulative impact of choices right now, affirmative choices that express your environmental values, that can lead to great change over time, right? If history is the study of change over time, then it's worth noting that, time is fast, and little steps that change the culture now, or that make affirmative steps towards a different culture, environmental culture, can really make a difference, right? I mean, we're here in Southern California, right? We understand that the culture of how we've used water in the past has endangered those of us today living in our region, right? And we understand that we have to take every action that we can to conserve water, because what we once treated as a profligate resource has now become scarce. And, if you study how those choices were made, what choices we made, how we got into this regime, we can begin to adaptively reuse what we left ourselves with, and come into a place where we can build something that represents our present values, and we don't have to be hidebound by the past, because we identify it and we see that it's constructed, right? It's not inevitable.
Right. It's almost like using these case studies from the past as cautionary tales for, look what happens then. Do we want to repeat that? Or look what happened in this local area that is very similar to ours, and look how different our cultures are now because of decisions that were made then. Shouldn't we not make that decision?
Right. Can we replicate theirs?
Making these other decisions.
Right. Or can we, but at least shows that we can live differently, and that there are many ways to live, right? Or to do things, or to organize our relation to the environment.
Yeah. Michelle would like to know, how would you introduce environmental history to middle school students learning about ecosystems and natural selection in science?
That's hard, in the sense that natural selection is generally a force that can't be captured in a certain way in traditional historical writing, right? It operates on such a longer time scale. I mean, I think what you could do is maybe look at you could do, in some sense, what Darwin did as a scientist, but do it as a historian, right? And look at populations of animals or humans who have certain unique traits that were, especially with animals, right, that are adaptive to their areas, right? And that are reflective, right? You think about, for instance, how sickle cell trait was healthful in an area where it increased resistance to bloodborne diseases that would otherwise have an easier time with traditionally shaped blood cells. And then you can look at that and see then how that one adaptation, while valuable in one environment, can shorten lifespans in another environment. And so you can see how, human population travel then made that particular trait a less desirable trait, one that can impact your health negatively. But that this was how human beings evolved to improve their health and increase their longevity in one particular environment.
I love that. And if I may add, I had an idea as well. I know this question
Go on, Sam.
wasn't for me, but I think Michelle, comparing natural selection versus artificial selection. And so taking case studies of, for instance, wolves versus pugs.
No, that's a classic example, right?
It's same genetic makeup,
Well,
right?
and you
And
can
it's how we selected for it, and what is actually more adapted to its environment, what is healthier in general. Spoiler alert, it's not pugs. So
what are you telling me, that pugs are not like going to be able to live off the land and hunt as well as a wolf? I
I'm sorry to burst your bubble there,
well,
Cyrus.
I guess you're not joining my pug hunting club. Uh,
That's a great question, Michelle. And really, these are excellent questions because you're right. I mean, I think as a scientist, I approach these questions in one way, right? In a specific way, looking at manipulative studies, for instance, but maybe this is a new way for me to reframe this in different ways, different information that I can bring into these education programs that I run as well.
well, you can even just look at primary sources to give you something different, right? You
Mhm.
can you can always simply, like, if you want to do like a basic sort of incorporation of environmental history into learning, right, at a lower level, you just look for sources where people wrote about the landscape or about natural forces that we still experience or places that we experience in the past, and you can immediately see differences to anyone who's familiar with a landscape that has changed,
Mhm.
right? And so their description gives you a way to teach how that landscape has changed. And because it's through the voice of a human being describing the landscape, it's highly relatable to a human being reading about the landscape and thinking about the landscape. And so that's a sort of like uh, an easy way to do it. There's also, just a material history, right? Like the basic thing that you would assign an undergraduate to write environmental history is you say, tell me the story of this one object. Bring an object into school and interrogate this object and what its past was and what human and natural forces led to this object, right? And suddenly, in a lot of objects that we have in our highly over-engineered society, you can tell a global history, right? And you can tell a global history of empire. Even you can tell a global history of race, you can tell a global history of economics, you can tell a global history of all of those things through a manufactured object, because of the disparate commodity flows involved and the human history that shaped the places where those things are being made and that led to those material conditions.
Yeah, what a wonderful tool. I love that. I think we have just another minute or two for questions. I don't see any other questions, but I want to give people an opportunity. Going once, going twice, type in your question or raise your hand to ask verbally. All right. I don't think we have any more questions. Cyrus, this was delightful. Thank you so much. I'm continually learning from you with your unique perspective. So I really appreciate you doing this talk tonight and hopefully informing people what environmental history is.
Look,
Like I learned a couple of months ago.
I swear to God, I was already a doctoral candidate, or not candidate, but a doctoral student in environmental history, that I understood that this was something that I had been trying to do, but that I didn't know was being done by other people, because so many historians found themselves dissatisfied with a way of history that ignored ecological relationships
Yeah.
and that saw them as beneath the study of human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. Well done, Cyrus. Thank you. And we have a bunch of thanks from the audience too. So we appreciate you being here tonight. Before you all take off, I did want to share one last thing. We do have another Naturally Speaking. I'm going to stop your share here, Cyrus, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine.
Bringing up mine again. And I want to thank the CNMF, our sponsor for the evening. And I also want to show you that I will be speaking actually at the next one. One of my great passions, and that is about birds. If any of you who know me know I'm a mega bird nerd. So we're going to be talking about how birds actually fly and that they are veritable flying machines. That's their primary adaptation and all of the things that go into making them able to fly, right? And so just keep your eyes peeled on cnmf.org. That's going to be sometime in May. And I will say that it's going to be family friendly, so ages 9 and up. And we're going to make it a hybrid event, so in person in the auditorium as well as virtually, with some props and some things I'm going to be having you do at home or in the auditorium with me. So ought to be a lot of fun, and I hope you join me for that. And again, I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank you for speaking, Cyrus, and I'd like to thank CNMF for hosting us. And that's it. That's all for next time. Thank you, everybody. See you next time. Bye.